complicated, you know, man. Like a damn Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messing up.
All right, Prudentialist. Welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you again for having me on.
Definitely, I'm excited to have you back on. You were an early guest, and hopefully we've gotten the show's a little bit more put together than it was last time.
Well, you know, growing pains is a very good thing to have when you're doing any kind of YouTube stuff. So, congratulations.
Oh, definitely. Thank you. Obviously, there's some new faces in the crowd. I'm happy to see. But anyway, we were talking before we went live. You and I have something very, very strongly in common, which is a love of the American Boomercon.
Oh yeah, I'm surrounded by them all the time, and they're so full of love for what they believe in, and they just have their own little ecosystem, kind of like ours. You know, their Ben Garrison comics, their love for certain accounts. They'll be the ones that definitely get on Truth Social, and so it's just very exciting to see, you know, how their politics are so similar to ours, yet at the same time, we're on a whole different level because we basically inject this stuff into our veins through Twitter and everything else, and they just yell about MSNBC and, you know, watch Tucker and Sean Hannity religiously.
I'm always impressed by the baby boomers' ability to find the most unhinged content on Facebook, right? Which on one hand is the most moderated platform you can imagine. And then on the other hand, it's like, wait, how in the world is there a community of 30,000 60 plus, you know, like retirees posting like edits of like Nancy Pelosi, the lizard person?
Well, I just think that they're kind of like us with like Telegram or YouTube or whatever. It's just, you know, they have some time on their hands. They're going to make their own versions of memes about why Biden is the Antichrist, and let them have it.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm a little bit younger than you, but I was 8 or 9 when like the whole Obama phenomenon and the amount of just like unhinged like boomer memes and boomer ideas about Barack Obama was, even as a child, I was like, well, this is insane. Like the whole like Obama is the Antichrist. You know, like you and Gio were talking about 9/11, which was a great stream. If I can plug that, but you were talking about all of the like, I forgot about these until you brought it up. Like all of the like witty like acronyms for Obama, like one bad mistake America, you know, all of those, which were like on every single like, you know, 10 to 15-year-old red pickup truck in the South for a while.
Yeah, I have this is from my time working in the college Republicans, in my time, much like a lifetime ago. But more or less, I have this mug, and one of these days I might have it on stream when I turn my camera on, is that it's a picture of George W. Bush just smiling, and it says, "Do you miss me yet?" And definitely just that peak 2008, 2009 era conservatism.
My old boss, and I wish I'd gotten this before he passed away and it got thrown away. But he had this giant mug that had it was so childish. It had Obama's face with a red X on one side and conservative debate expert on the other. And that had been sitting on his desk probably since 2007. But I wanted that thing so bad.
Yeah, I mean, Obama, some other choice slur-like names for Obama. That and just the fact that we went from, you know, more or less 8 years of Middle Eastern adventurism into Iraq and Afghanistan to have an economy go to shit so fast that America does this like neck break split 180 to elect a guy that, you know, not only is not white, but also has the middle name Hussein that had its own birther allegation coming into it. It's just a very surreal time of American politics.
Yeah, I remember. So there's this guy at my grandparents' Southern Baptist church, and this is an absolute like you probably know 10 guys like this, and so he's a Vietnam vet named Barry. He wore a boonie hat absolutely everywhere. I think he was an electrician. This part's kind of unclear. And he used to go dove hunting with me and my grandpa. And dove hunting for Barry basically meant that he sat in a field with a shotgun and talked to anyone who would listen about politics. And he told me, this is slightly jumbled, both because it wasn't super coherent and I was probably 10 years old when he told me this. Some like insane theory about how Obama was both Kenyan and his dad was Saddam Hussein, hence the middle name. I just remember being like in elementary school as this like very animated man was telling me about, alternating between stories about when he was in Nam and, Barack Hussein Obama, and being like, I don't know, man. I don't know if I quite believe that one, but it was incredibly entertaining.
Well, my grandmother and grandfather are sort of the same way. They'll get these like chain emails that'll try and link some, piece and chapter and verse of Revelation to whatever the current political goings on is. And there was just email after email like that visiting her during the Obama years, that anytime he did something, it was just one step closer to like the rapture and the end of the world. It was a different time, but I think, the Boomercon can put some work out there and some takes that I think would rival the best schizo poster on Telegram or Twitter.
Well, it's funny because I feel like there's kind of two paths for the boomer. There's kind of the eternal, and that's an incredibly pretentious sentence, but there's on one hand the just like, and this is kind of what my grandpa is, like the eternal Sean Hannity viewer, where it's like, the everything is, well, we'll just vote more next time. And then the other option is the most like insane Fed posting you've ever heard in your life, and there's absolutely no in between. You have two options as a vaguely right wing baby boomer.
Yeah, it's either we're gonna rally them, we're gonna kick all the rhinos out, and we're gonna vote in the real Republicans that are gonna do everything, or it's the boomer waffen. There's no in between. It's 0 or 60.
Well, and part of that is that, and this is something that I really do kind of love about the baby boomers, which you kind of hinted, is that there is like a real sincerity. That there's this idea that, well, things just work. And if we do the thing, get out and vote, we do, the high school civics class thing, it'll work. And this like kind of, and part of that's a little bit of naivete, but there's another part of it which is kind of admirable, that they actually do things. And fair enough, maybe the thing that they do is start a horribly obese, local militia when, Ralph Northam says he's going to take their guns, but at least they're actually like doing something, which I've always found, at least to a certain degree, admirable.
Their sincerity is always appreciated in the same way that for them, though, they were really the last generation where the high school civics class get out to vote type deal probably had a much greater impact than it does now. And I mean, that's just by nature of how the American political system has both evolved and degraded over time in terms of what the average citizen can do. Not to say that their options are still not available to us. I just think that they are more significantly watered down in the face of money, special interest groups, and other outside constraints. But it does illustrate that, yeah, they have a sincerely, deeply held belief on it. And I think that that's why it was very easy for so many of the sort of boomer conservatives and Gen X as well to just sort of fall for the madness that is that certain idea or group or movement associated with the 17th letter of the alphabet.
I think one of the other things that's interesting is that for at least older baby boomers, they still went to mildly functional public schools. And it's interesting to hear the absolute disbelief, because my paternal grandfather is kind of he's an archetype in the sense that he kind of did all the things that kind of like Reagan conservatives say you're supposed to do. So, he messed up, he got his high school girlfriend pregnant, but, he went into the army and he found the Lord at a Billy Graham rally, and he started a business and he turned himself around, and now he's, sitting on a good amount of wealth. But it's interesting because one of the things that he did in between, like right after he got out of the service, was he went to, he was a high school teacher. And it's interesting hearing him talk about it, because on one hand, he saw when essentially my state got desegregated by force. So it was officially desegregated a little bit before, but it wasn't really in effect. And I realize this is a delicate topic that we don't necessarily need to get into, but he essentially saw the start of the rot hit public schools. It was the 70s, and it was interesting hearing him talk about it, because he both completely recognizes that, the public schools are gone and the public schools have failed. But his point for it is very much like, well, if we just got rid of unions, it would be fine. And it's odd to me because on one hand, he's seen it firsthand. He saw, the system break down. He saw just the skyrocketing violence. I think he was actually assaulted by students. And it's always odd to me that on one hand, it's like they lived through it, but they're still so kind of immersed in kind of like the cultural narrative about, what happened in their own lifetimes.
Yeah, and I mean, to throw in our friend Pete Quinones a plug, there was also the issue, of course, of dealing with integration and things like that, which he's currently streaming on a very good book by Mr. Saltzman about that very issue and what it caused. And I think that also plays a role in sort of the degradation of a lot of public education, is that now you have to cater with an environment that's never really existed before and continues to show dysfunction no matter how much money you throw at it. And that was definitely something that comes to mind with also that sort of like George W. Bush era conservatism, was this idea of school choice being sort of like the civil rights era of the time, and No Child Left Behind being the issue of trying to equalize the achievement gap, which the claims were for a very short period of time that it did, and then all the cheating scandals came out in various school districts across America. Like El Paso Independent School District is only known by most people not because you went to a high school or something there, but it's because it was a part of the biggest cheating scandal from No Child Left Behind in order to keep getting money from the federal government.
Well, it's funny because, and this is again a generational thing, that one of my earliest memories, because we didn't have cable growing up, so we had PBS, and they would like in essentially like the little like, because it wasn't quite sponsors, but it was kind of sponsors as like NPR. But they were sponsored by the No Child Left Behind Foundation or whatever it was. I can't remember. And so it was odd to me that I didn't really realize that was like a government initiative, because to me that was always, well, that's who funds Between the Lions or Sesame Street or whatever. And it's odd to me kind of like learning later, like, wait a minute, that was not only something real, but incredibly impactful. And the last like vestiges of kind of like shitlibism I kind of like drove out of myself was, my freshman year of college. And I can remember exactly the moment it really happened, where all of a sudden I was like, well, fine, just I'm done with these people. And this is quite an admission. I realize this is a deeply sinful act, but there was a brief period of time when I was probably like 17 to 18 where I watched John Oliver, and he had a special about education, and he managed to draw a connection. And I remember this cleanly because it had the like John Oliver bit of say something outrageous, wait for a moment, and then be like, but wait, it's really true. And he drew a line from Nathan Bedford Forrest to No Child Left Behind to charter schools. And I remember sitting in the dining hall and I was like, wait a minute, you have no idea what you're talking about. And so it's interesting because I've obviously, like, I never went to public high school. I went to a private school and I was homeschooled before that. So I'm not going to say like this is firsthand experience, but it is odd that like this seems to be this kind of like an absolutely intractable problem. And yet the only answer is, well, guess what? If we throw more money at it, it'll work this time. I promise.
Well, I mean, that's just a really good way to keep the people that are your people, employed and things like that. And on top of the fact that if the real issue were to be solved, then the ideological presuppositions that you base your worldview on would be fundamentally challenged. And that's sort of the nature, I think, of a lot of progressive politics, is that you live in a constant state of not digital, I was about to say, oh goodness, the word is cognitive dissonance. Thank you. I'm trying to think to myself here, but you're in a point of cognitive dissonance all the time, where it's just like things like, well, race isn't real unless we're talking about like white people, or that the achievement gap is due to structural racism, not due to race. But there's all sorts of things like that that come in mind, and so, well, if we keep throwing more money at the problem, then we have our guys that are in charge. The system can keep growing, and that means we have a larger amount of institutional control that, if anyone wants to speak out against it, then that's the issue. And I mean, that happened a lot in El Paso too, when it came to like charter schools, because like charter schools are blowing up in that city right now. And when they were first starting to come into the county, there was just outrage after outrage pieces from members of the local teachers union getting ready to like tear it down.
Well, incidentally, one of the like the biggest, because I think like with everyone, right? There's kind of like a slow progression of like, and I hate this analogy, but it's an apt one, but of kind of like taking red pills one by one. And one of the biggest ones for me is so my fiance is a school teacher, and her first year she worked at a public school in Richmond, Virginia, which, as I've said multiple times, is one of the top 10 most dangerous cities in America. And they have 22 elementary schools. Actually, they have 21. Sorry, the 22nd burned down, which is further illustrates my point. But she was essentially at the worst school in the city. And just listening to her talk and like the problems that happened there. So, for instance, right, the principal of the school drove a brand new Mercedes Benz. She is the type of person who you'd imagine drives a financed Mercedes. And she was like, and she drives in and she parks, and I walk up next to her into a classroom that has rats and cockroaches and no AC. The money, it all gets funneled in, and the money goes to other things. It's essentially just like a payment system for, like you said, right? Like it's pure and simple patronage. And I think that one of the things, and I don't mean to sound like overly soft about this, where it's like, but it's very obvious that this isn't a system that's really benefiting, I guess, like the people who are experiencing it firsthand, right? Like, I think it's very easy to kind of like, oh, XYZ community is benefiting, quote unquote. So they're our like real enemy, so to speak, right? But you kind of like live, or not live, you work in a place like that, and you're like, wait a minute, like, okay, if the benefit is you get to do whatever you want, but what you want to do is essentially live a debased life, right? Like, that's not a good solution for anyone, unless you're in power, right? And you're essentially like getting the benefit of the patronage system, right? But obviously, like, the plebs in this situation aren't exactly, living like fulfilling lives.
Well, no, and I mean that's sort of the way that if you can keep the people as miserable as possible, then at that point you're in a position to, constantly look back and point and say, "Oh, look at all these poor, like suffering children, and look at like the systemic issue. Like, clearly, give us more money, vote for us." I mean, it's been the grift as long as I've been alive, and probably much longer before my lifetime. Is just how easy it was to facilitate these carefully tailored areas of misery and poverty and just absolute commiseration. That way you can have this little activist consultant class, document their struggle and, tell people to give their money, while at the same time that money will never go to them. And, the problem perpetuates itself, and these consultant union types continue to get richer and richer.
No, definitely. I agree on that one. It's and I feel like you can kind of summarize a lot of the, I guess, like the really valuable insights from the dissident right on the back of a note card, or if you could rather. I feel like the number one thing I would tell people is the patronage model, right? Like, viewing everything as kind of like, that isn't something humans stopped doing after ancient Rome, because it really does offer like a certain amount of explanatory power, because without it you're kind of left grasping for like, well, why is everyone just stupid? Like, oh, they don't know what they're doing. They're so stupid. They're so, like, incompetent. And don't get me wrong, they are stupid and incompetent. But the thing I always notice this with actually is with libertarians. So every once in a while, like when I'm like out working, doing something manual, and I don't have anything to listen to, I'll go back to, Ryan Dawson, the Lulbird 9/11 guy. And he's interesting enough on certain topics, but he has massive Lulbert blind spots. And it's always odd to me that he describes situations like that as they're so stupid, they don't understand what they're doing. They have no idea that this won't work. And I guess to me, it's like, well, what makes more sense? That they're just incredibly powerful, but incredibly stupid, or they've essentially kind of like, they're playing the game correctly. It's just that the game isn't necessarily the same thing as governing well.
Yeah, this is the thing where you have stupid people, don't get me wrong, but I think that you need, like, this is the whole concept that, we talk about with like Midwits or bio-Leninism. Like, you need those like 100 IQ type people in order to be your commissars or to be your teachers to indoctrinate, because their authorities aren't going to be questioned or anything like that. While at the same time, there are some very high up people in charge of various, institutions and platforms that by no way, shape, or form I would never call them stupid or unintelligent. But you just have that collective system to where you can offer people who know they don't deserve it, whether that's power or responsibility, clearly like the midwit type, and put them in a position where they can feel a semblance of power, and also at the same time know that they're in the good graces of the system, because they're either on the right side of history, as people like to say, or that there is the just the social agreeableness factor. People want to be on the side that is considered liked, not the side that is perhaps right but is socially hated and things like that. And that's always something that we've seen for as old as time. I mean, the patronage system, of course, is definitely up there. I would also throw up that bit from the open letter from unqualified reservations is the manipulation of procedural outcomes to get a desired result. And that's why, institutional capture is so important, because you can, pass a law that says we're going to ban X, but then we can watch them, because they control the institution, change the definition of X so they can still get what they want. And we see this a lot when it comes to public education. We see this a lot when it comes to a lot of the social issues, like the definition of sexual harassment and sexual assault changed constantly due to Obama's Dear Colleague letter, which is where a lot of some of the like 2014, 2015 era culture war stuff comes from. It's just those are definitely things that are a tale as old as time.
Right. And I recently have been kind of like searching for full-time employment, right? So I've had to do a ton of essentially like HR stuff, and a lot of that, like even before, like once you've applied or you're kind of in the middle stage of a process, they'll make you basically go through like sexual assault training. And I've found out, and I realize I shouldn't be shocked by this, but the new standard for sexual assault includes, and this was a specific example, and it was a little like video. And the video basically shows like an elderly woman who calls a trans person by their original gender. And the big question at the end is this sexual assault? Is this rude but not illegal, or is it not a problem? And I was like, this is a perfectly reasonable, like I'm actually trying to, hide my power level and just get a job. I'm not trying to like make a point here. But I was like, okay, that's probably rude. Like I would say that's rude. No, it turns out that at least at this one company, they were treating misgendering as sexual assault, which is, I guess I shouldn't be surprised by this, but nonetheless, I was a little bit taken aback at that point.
Wow. Granny, naming their, calling their granddaughter or whatever by their original name.
Wandering the ruins is a good point. Sexual assault training sounds wrong. I should have clarified. It was anti-sexual assault training. I don't need training. I'm professional.
Well, there you go. Hope no one ever finds out who you are. This guy's a professional sexual assault guy. But that there was a tweet that had that was talking about some recent reports about just sort of the sexes and things like that. That was talking about like nearly 44% of like young men, I think it was like ages 18 to 25 or whatever, simply do not approach women because they're afraid of being perceived as a creep. And I certainly think that is a consequence of a lot of this sexual harassment, sexual positivity culture. Like, you don't need to take this, like you can get what you want, or don't let anyone think that you're a creep or a groomer or some kind of problematic personality. And this is what gets you, is a sort of generational death cult of just not doing anything.
No, definitely. I completely see it, and I kind of sidestepped it, but I know people for whom it is to a certain degree kind of paralyzing, especially like it was a big problem at like public colleges, right? Because it very much is like that, that meme you've all seen, where it's the attractive guy who, comes into the cubicle, and she's like, oh, whatever you want, where it's the ugly guy she's calling HR, and I met people for whom they're like, yeah, I just don't ask girls out because of that fear, right? Like it's very real.
Yeah, and I do think that the university system does not help. The the consequences of the sexual revolution hasn't helped either. I mean, that's just a litany of issues, right? That you could spend a whole other stream on just talking about the sexual revolution and its consequences, the dear colleague letter, women's lib, sexual positivity. Although I do think that we really are, and I've talked about this with Geo and others, is that in about 10, 15 years, we're going to see a psychological crisis like nobody's seen before when you get to that 50% plus one of millennials hitting over 40 and younger people having less sex than ever. There's just going to be a disaster headed our way, psychologically speaking, not just, societal functions, but I mean, you have a bunch of angry, pent up, resentful people that were sold on a lie, women especially, and men that have been utterly put into a emasculated box that the only time that they are attractive, is when women are taking neurochemically altering substances that affect their bodies that make them attracted to one another. And then their relationships break up if she decides to quit taking the pill. And so it's just a really depressing state of affairs in this regard, which is always sad because then you get a lot of sympathy for really antisocial and dare I, and everyone likes this sort of, I like to say that there's room for misogyny or sexism. You just have to do it in a paternal fashion, but to do it in some form or fashion where um like today I had said something along the lines of like, you really can't replace the family with technocratic solutions. um and yeah, I said no technocratic solution will replaces the family, and no amount of wine or dog food can substitute it. And someone had said, actually, we can replace the femoids, and I'm like, this ain't it, chief.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
right.
that there's a better kind of behavior that we should be approaching, and I think that that is a problem that a mix of anonymity and just the nature of being transgressive or based really does have, is that sometimes we just come off like the most antisocial kind of spurg people that you don't want to associate or be around.
No, I definitely see it, and I also see it in kind of this like eternal, like reflexive contrarianism. That like there's simultaneously, there's that current line of like, oh, like the right doesn't need to care about novelty. Which fair enough if you agree in a tradition. I guess that's probably true. And this is coming from legitimately the least original person on the DR. So you can take that with a grain of salt. But on the other hand, it's like there's always someone and something new we have to rehabilitate. And look, I get it. A lot of it's joking. Like the base Talachad it was funny, right? Because it is to a certain degree a joke. But there is a point at which like just because it makes liberals mad does not mean you should do it. Like while that is a useful heuristic sometimes, it is kind of this like slightly, I guess, just immature and kind of like childish way to look at it.
Yeah, I do, and this is something that back, with the Taliban, like you had mentioned. I mean, that was why Charlemagne's point was very, very good about, look, this isn't your victory or whatever. Like, you really should be advocating in a way for, maybe a change in American foreign policy that also doesn't paint you as a Taliban sympathizer. Like, keep in mind that regardless of your opinion on the war, like your fellow countrymen just spent 20 years dying in this region, and thousands more are still dying of suicide. Maybe cheering on their enemy is probably not the best degree of the way of going forward on that, regardless of which. And I think there's also a bit of cognitive dissonance when it comes to, and I like third worldism or xenophilia. Like, yeah, it's nice to see other people strike out a victory and, retain some of their own sovereignty. I think that that's always a good thing when we can promote the sovereignty of other countries. We should also be doing it for ourselves, and that maybe that should be also done in ways where we're not constantly rooting for our enemies, because yeah, it's great to make a great Talachad meme or something like that. But the issue, especially, I think, in that regard would be, well, the people that we would want to attract to our side, people of influence or people of means to be patrons to perhaps traditional or other right-wing causes, they probably don't want to be throwing their money to people that are spending their time doing these bizarre, like, Talachad edits in synthwave. The memes are great, but I think sometimes when it comes to the issue of, well, who do we really want our audience to be besides our core audience, our patrons and things like that? Well, ideologically speaking, we would also want to definitely move in a way that gets us in a better direction not just on the online space, but also within the minds and ears of those that might be thankful to our causes, like the Boomercon, like we were talking about in the beginning.
Well, right. And I think that there's, to a certain degree, a tension between the desire to be kind of a anti-populist, like vanguard type movement, which on one hand, it's like, well, in that case, like, screw the optics, like, oh, we're only going for a hardcore. On the other end, kind of like the eternal optics cuck, who's just like, oh, the like always the myth of the wider audience. But the point is, it's like, well, okay, like if you're an elite, like if you're a vanguard, well, you still need people, and you need powerful and influential people. And if someone is powerful and influential and you're acting like a spurg, well, like you said, right? Like, well, they're probably not going to listen to you. They're not going to take you seriously unless you kind of demand to be taken seriously.
Yeah, and I talked about this in a stream a while back, just about 3 basic issues of mentorship, maturity, and meaning. And my biggest issue, of course, is that there are plenty of smart and intelligent people, and a lot of people that are also almost twice my age, if not older, that follow and listen and offer their feedback, which I'm incredibly thankful for. And that's something that I think is very important, is that we want to encourage more pro-social behavior. It is great sometimes to make memes or to do in towers or whatever on Twitter or chat or in comments or whatever. Like, I get it. Trust me, it's fun as hell. I'm very guilty of it. But at the same time, I think what the optics cuck thing is really, it should be more so about, can you be authentic in what you actually believe in? Can you explicate it? Are you willing to learn in the face of contradictory and new information? And can you make a convincing case for a positive vision that isn't just anti-left or, anti-progressive? Because it's great to stand against what the left is, but then when you're forced with the question of, well, what is to be done or what is next, then that, I think, is one of the bigger challenges that is going to be set forth between us. Because also there's the ideological aspect of it. Like, yeah, in a lot of ways, the dissident right does have a revolutionary aim, which is why you do get sort of this weird bit of Leninism that pops in when talking about a vanguard, or even the quotation of what is to be done. And, to some degree, that's probably true, that those questions need to be you need to be focusing on, can you be relatable to your audience? Can you not be a liar or appear to be hypocritical or two-faced? And can you be humble enough to admit when you're wrong on things, or that, hey, I didn't have all the facts on this, let me revisit it. And those are the things that I admire the most about a lot of the people here in these spheres, is that I don't think I've ever met anyone IRL or communicated with anybody online that isn't authentic, relatable, or anything like that, especially when they are on a platform to articulate their ideas. And I think that that's something that needs to be encouraged above all else. And that's why, like, the biggest theme that I think I've been running from in 2020, or running for with in 2022, is just that if you're going to turn off your phone at night and you're perpetually online, I want you to, like, see your face in the reflection of the screen and be happy with what you see. Because if not, then we have also much bigger problems with ourselves too.
I completely agree. And it's this hard, and I was talking, when I was talking to Radlib, we kind of brought this up, where it's like, we are very much in a unique decision of, we don't really have the option of true authenticity, because to a certain extent, if you have to think about it, it's not authentic anymore. Like, you've made it a decision. And there are so many things that we all talk about that never before in human history were decisions. So we'll just take family stuff because it's an easier one to go with. To be perfectly honest, like, if you wanted a relationship with a woman, you were a father essentially by default. I mean, there was just no way getting around that. But now, with the kind of like the advent of, the pill and, a whole nother like series of laws and things, like, the decision to be a parent is an active one, whereas before, for our ancestors, it was just something that you kind of were by default. And so, that kind of extends to, a multitude of other things, where all of these, kind of baseline human things are no longer defaults. They're active choices you have to make. And so it is this odd thing where it's like, simultaneously we're telling people to do the most natural thing in the world, but also you have to learn how to do it, which is a very odd place to put yourself in.
Yeah, no, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And not to, I don't want to sound like I'm plugging constantly, but this was an issue I sort of talked about in one of my older fishing videos, a real talk about mentorship. And one of the things that I had observed for a lot of people online is that, we want to be human. We want to do what came naturally to those before us in a time and age where those things are up for debate, under attack, and constantly being subjected to academic deconstruction in sort of a very post-structural kind of fashion, where like the project of modernity is evolving into a postmodern hellscape, and it's also just as bad. And there are people online, like there's a whole YouTube channel called like How to Dad, for people who didn't have a father around to teach them basic things like changing a tire or whatnot. Like it's good to have that, but when it has like a million subscribers, to me, an alarm comes off in the back of my head about, well, what does this say about society writ large, about fatherhood and teaching and an example? Like I'm very blessed to have my father, and I'm very blessed that I grew up with him, and to have those experiences of getting yelled at in the garage about how to work on parts of my car or something like that when I was 15. And I know not a lot of people have that these days, and I find that to be terrifying. And so the parasocial relationship has this weird substitute that can never be the substitute for the real thing. But at the same time, it's also a sign of the fact that there are a lot of people out there that are looking for mentorship and advice, and that's a big gap and hurdle that we have to overcome for sure.
Yeah, and that's why, and maybe I sound like a broken record on this channel, because if there's like one piece of continuous advice I give out, it's connect with older men. Because I think that that's both something that obviously there's a practical element to that. Like, well, okay, how did I learn how to change a tire? Well, some dude who was 65 years old and had a beer gut and loved to talk about Rush Limbaugh taught me how to do it, And so it's things like that where it's like, you kind of have to, again, these are not things that you used to have to try to do. These would have kind of been default relationships in your life. And so it's why I'm kind of always shilling people like, look, go get involved in a institution, an institution with people who are not your age. And you know what, if that's a religious institution, great. I'm far from the person for proselytizing, just due to my own, like personal baggage. But like, to me, it's like, I don't know how we get out of this without some type of like intergenerational relationship, like mentorship, just because there's great things to be had with a group of guys in their 20s, right? Like there's a lot of energy there, but there truly is a wisdom with age. And I think that we kind of ignore that and become like the Zoomerwaffen at our own peril.
Yes, and I do agree with the advice that you give, is talking to older men and finding organizations, clubs, churches, or whatever that allows you to do that. I think that it is important that, and then of course, this isn't just, there are plenty of people in this chat, and I'm sure that there are plenty of people in our respective subscriber groups that, are well-adjusted individuals that come here either for entertainment or for the conversation, whatever that may be. But I also know that as people get younger and younger, or as the generations that we see are more sort of perpetually infantilized, and that encourages this sort of behavioral but also like physical neotony of constantly wanting to have that eternal spring of looking young and being young and not worrying about anything else, that we see it in our language, we see it in commercials, this idea of adulting and things like that, which I really hate that term. Because, oh, look at me, I'm paying taxes and I'm adulting. Like, no, you're just living in like society. Like everyone has to do this. Like, just don't make it out to be special because you're, oh, look at me, I'm like 20 something and I'm doing my taxes. Well, every 20 something is probably doing their taxes, and hopefully, they've figured it out. But if not, then they probably should go to someone and learn how to do it. I mean, yeah, don't get me wrong. Taxes is probably the worst example, because sometimes the tax code can just be a real pain in the ass. But I feel gravely concerned, and myself, I'm just as guilty of this. This is why in my spare time I like try and take up all these other skills that would require one to manage well, to manage land and things like that. Because if not, then, well, when those people who did know how to do these things, when the patriarchs of our life did, when they do pass and they do die, then we're going to be up shit creek without a paddle when it comes to managing these things. Because there are some things in life that, Google does not have the answers for, that you really are going to want someone one-on-one or in person to help you with.
Well, and oftentimes they're surprisingly simple things. So when I used to work for a major car collection, and oftentimes if things got fixed, they had to be fixed essentially by someone who was 85 years old, because the car was from 1935, and 3 people in America actually understand how to make it work again, and you can't go down to Napa and get a new part. So there was this guy, and I love this guy because he was basically a King of the Hill character. His name is Claude. He's 85 years old. He could fix absolutely anything. And he had all the hallmarks we were talking about and he was older. He was probably silent generation of a Boomercon, right? And he had, the sticker on his door that said, I hope my TV is worth more than your life, all that kind of stuff. But it was kind of a sobering realization when, he eventually passed away, that it's like, oh, like if this breaks now, no one fixes it. And he had a son who can do a decent enough job. And I mean, it wasn't the end of the world, but it was kind of the first time I really firsthand came up with this, like, oh, wait, there's just no one to fix this. The knowledge is lost. It was lost with him. And I wonder if, as kind of America continues to, South Africanize, that will become kind of more and more common.
I mean, potentially. I would see it likely happening, especially when, like, the auto industry, I think, is actually a really good example because, a car from 30 years ago was a car. It wasn't a glorified computer, cell phone, everything was electronic, which is why a big reason why I think cars have gotten so expensive these days. And you have to go to the dealership or some really niche specialist to take care of it. And, that's also the other issue about, the right to repair and all that, because, well, if your car is basically one giant computer now and you're not supposed to tamper with it, then you're sort of left being completely dependent. And the car has always fundamentally been this very American sign of freedom that, if shit hits the fan, right, I can get in my car and I can leave. Or if I wanted to, I can get out of my town for vacation and just, go to a national park or something. And if it breaks down, then I know I can go reliably put on my spare, drive to a shop and repair it myself and do what's necessary. If not, seek a mechanic. And nowadays that doesn't seem likely. And, my grandfather is still with me and he's in his 80s. And he oftentimes my dad will call him for like technical advice, or he'll come over to look at something and offer his expertise to repair things. And I just know that this wealth of technical knowledge will be gone once he dies. And it really does behoove us to pass along what we do know and make sure that whatever skills that we have, we can pass that down to the next generation. So yeah, join a club, join like an auto club, join, an association for gardening or whatever. Like you one, man needs hobbies, and two, hobbies should be good because those hobbies can oftentimes be a trade or a skill or something that you can turn into to make money. And I find that to be really important, and which is partially why, again, you can't be explicitly political 100% all the time. You need to be human, and believe it or not, I know it's a very niche thing for men to have a greater interest in politics, but not everyone does, and there are good ways to be relatable in other forms and fashion. And I think that through that, I mean, politics inevitably comes up, but emergency response, going to a first aid class, things like that. I mean, that'll take you a long way in being someone that the community can look to and say that that man is reliable, that man is a leader, that man has a certain kind of skill set that can really be a benefit, and we can go to him for expertise.
So 2 things. One, the broke take is that Obama is the Antichrist because of politics. The woke take is that Obama is the Antichrist because he ruined cars, which is really my take. But in all seriousness, there is one of the other like truly admirable things about the baby boomer generation is that essentially if you show up and you're relatively put together, you're clean shaven, you're not dressed like a complete hooligan, and if you just ask old men questions, they will talk to you for as much time as you have. And you can learn a ton by essentially just finding, old timers. For me, I found a lot of them through church or, people my grandparents know. But really, like, you can get a shocking amount of knowledge by just listening to, the elderly talk. And it's kind of fun. And after a while, like you can kind of, it's definitely 100% at a different speed than like hyper, terminally online Zoomers communicate at, but it's kind of fun. And I don't know, at least for me, like it's something I truly do enjoy. Another kind of like positive about the Boomercons is that.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, they love it when you take the time to ask questions and ask them about what they do or how they did a certain thing. One, because it's sort of that weird boomer narcissism of just like, let me tell you how I got this car to work or whatever, or how I got a steal on this certain piece of equipment or whatever. And you're still going to learn a lot, and at the same time, it's a good entryway to show that someone is interested in what they can do, and that you'll inevitably learn something. And at the end of the day, a lot of these hobbies and a lot of these things or trades or whatever, you don't have to own much or to be incredibly independently wealthy to sort of just know a thing or two in order to get by or to help out somebody else. And I think that those are important things for us to keep in mind. It's just that we do have to be pro-social, pro-community, and that those things cannot just be platitudes on the internet. Otherwise, what good is this advice if it falls upon deaf ears and it comes out of hypocritical lips?
Well, and here's another kind of like hack to learn things, like specifically home repair, is if you go to a church that's large enough and has some type of like mutual aid function, oftentimes people will have kind of like minor home emergencies, that they can't really afford to pay for. So they'll go to the church. And normally like churches will send out a group of congregants to go help them. A lot of times it's basic stuff like, oh, a tree fell down, you cut it down. But the best part about this is because it's volunteering, they can't be mad at you if you don't know what you're doing. So that's the real hack. You essentially volunteer to do something, which is obviously like a morally good thing to do, but you get the benefit of having essentially a free attempt. And obviously don't like ruin someone's home doing it. But I learned a lot by essentially showing up to church functions with my grandpa. And some dude would hand me a chainsaw and be like, all right, figure out how it works. And it's a good way to build up skills and while also kind of like building like positive male relationships.
Absolutely. And again, organizations like this can be in non-explicitly political ones, like church or mutual aid societies, or even taking up the time to take care of a park or volunteering to clean it up or anything like that. Showing genuine pro-social behavior is something that really does behoove all of us to do. I mean, within my church, like I've said on my channel and other places on Twitter, I spent a week taking care of my good friend's elderly mom and her dog. And it's like, why I was like out for a week and a half. Those things are very important, just in the ability to know that you can be reliable to those that actually that do matter to you, but also because it does show that people can rely on you. And in this point in time, we really do need to be reliable, relatable, and authentic.
Yeah, and I think that if you can really describe, and this is not a particularly revolutionary concept, right? But you're familiar with like the basic, types of narrative, right? Like, man versus nature, man versus man versus God. And to a certain degree, I feel like that the story of the last couple of years has essentially been, man's search for authenticity is kind of like fake. And, like Instagram as that sounds, I feel like there's something true to it, that essentially like, at least for now, and who knows, maybe this will go away, that kind of like the base, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like we've kind of solved the bottom three, like we don't really need to at least many people don't really feel struggle in their daily life anymore. And it's just left so many of us with this like bizarre emptiness. And so like so much of, obviously there's a lot of practical advice that I try to give out and you're pretty good about giving out, but in many ways it is just kind of, we're not telling people, like how not to starve. It's very much like, well, how do you not feel like your life is a giant waste of time?
Well, I do think that that's part and parcel for a significant devoid of any kind of spiritual life. Um, in all aspects of religion, especially in the West, is sort of the secularism of the modern project comes and creeps into it. I mean, when, even the hijab in like England or whatever has become this weird like LGBTQ plus like feminist symbol and not what, it's originally meant for in terms of regards to like modesty and things like that. It does illustrate that most traditional aspects of religion are under attack, and that, the spiritual life and the emptiness that we face does leave so many. And Turnip's video on the Zoomers is so good on this point, where people are so desperate to search for meaning that, teenagers and, men in their very early 20s will, burn through every political ideology and every kind of religion and dabble in it as some kind of fad that will try and fill the hole in their heart and in their mind, only to be these burnt out husks by the end of the day. And that is the greatest aspect that we also need to fight, because, well, what does that leave you to do? Well, that leaves you playing, video games over and over, or listening to the same streamer, or looking for, through pornography or whatever. And you're really only continuously digging that grave further and further, which is always really unfortunate. And in that point in time, that's when you see so many people feeling constantly depressed or searching for some kind of way to, find their own salvation out of this modern project. And this is one of the biggest issues I think that progressivism has, is that, I'll ask this to you and I'll also ask this to the audience, is that what is the progressive liberal role model for straight white men? There isn't one.
Yeah, I mean, the closest thing you have is kind of like the leftist Twitch streamer. Like, to me, that's the closest one, but that's only a stopgap.
Well, yeah, and even then, take a look at the very people that Dave the Distributist talks about all the time, which is BreadTube. All of these people end up having to create some other additional facet to their identity in order to get over the fact that they are panged by the fact that there is no positive role model for being a straight white male. You have to be an ally. You have to be neurodivergent. You have to be non-binary. You have to put on lipstick and shave your head. You have to come out and transition in some form or fashion, because there is nothing that allows you to be, progressively straight, white, and male without the caveats of sounding like an unhinged sort of self-chastising lunatic. I mean, just look at how, and I think Michael points it out in the chat very well, like, look at how Ron Perlman turned into over the Trump years on Twitter. Like, that is a clearly mentally unwell and unhinged person. And that's what you're sort of left with. And I think that that's a big part of what, in regards to a positive vision, the right really does need to stop offering. Because it's nice when you can sell people an aesthetic, like a nuclear family, or, a baby's baptism and chrismation at a church. Like, that's great and everything. But at the same time, we can't just offer them aesthetics. Like, there needs to be sort of a community space and offering people that kind of advice or places to go to. Like, I've had people DM me, and people your age and younger, some 19-year-old asking for advice on things. And it's very weird to be in my later 20s to be asked those kind of questions, because it's like, well, I can tell you what not to do, but you need to prepare yourself to be a mentor and to be available to people in ways that are constructive.
Well, and maybe that is because I think there's been a conversation going on for a year or so, at least most explicitly since the US event, about, well, what's the positive vision of the right? And maybe that's the positive vision of the right. Your life will have meaning. You kind of won't want to just put a bullet in your brain, or kind of, just like endlessly, consume and consume, until you finally like shuffle off the mortal coil. And maybe that's a bit pretentious, but to me, that does seem like at least one option is some kind of like, unifying standard to rally around.
Well, yeah, but the problem is, though, is that it will appear by your character. I don't think it will appear just by your podcasts or what you say and do online, because I'm just as prone to break out in little comedy bits and things like that. I mean, everyone should have a good time and things like that, but you can't sell people on like, listen to this and it'll change your life. Like, there's no 12 rules for life. I think that, I mean, you can read that book over and over. You can read church fathers. You can read all the self-help advice that you want, or talk to a therapist or whatever. And I think that the big issue will be, okay, great, that's going to show in your personal behavior and how you conduct yourself IRL. It won't be how, I mean, it'll show in your online behavior as well, but you can't sell people an aesthetic, right? Like you can't just send them a playlist of 12 hours of like, Giga Chad Gregorian chant to listen to while you're studying or something. You can't send them a bunch of Norman Rockwell or, middle America advertisements from the 1950s, because that's great and all, but it's also a facsimile of what life is actually going to look like for you.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It's a kind of it's turning and look, like I enjoy all those things as much as the next guy, but it's kind of in much the same way that you're essentially turning like a normal life into a consumer identity. And obviously like there's a certain utility in creating something, popular that people like and people want to kind of model themselves after. I'm not denying that. But that we are in this weird spot as kind of like these internet traditionalists where essentially we're all we're all online so we can tell everyone to get offline, and to do things in real life. And I recognize kind of like the hypocrisy there, but it is an odd position to kind of find ourselves in.
And I think that you'll see that a lot in regards to I mean, everyone's behavior online, even if you put on like the world's best act, I think that a semblance of your real life self is going to pierce through. And that's going to definitely be a concern that I think we'll have to face on in the future. Because yeah, I would really hate it if this somehow became, if I looked down the line 20 years from now and say I'm still doing this, which one I kind of hope to. This would be nice if this could be like a way to write and talk about things. But I would hate if I like look back in myself and see myself in the mirror and I'm like a right wing Hassan, or Destiny streamer. Like that's not the kind of life that I would like to live, and that's not the kind of life I would want anyone watching this to live.
I don't know. I will say there's a part of me that like kind of does want to become the Gen Z equivalent of Rush Limbaugh, but maybe that's a little bit too too on the nose.
I mean, if you're good at it, I mean, I don't think that anyone should let their talents go to waste. But
Just got to start smoking a lot more.
There you go. And I mean, really, John Stewart really did get a lot of his sort of act from like Rush Limbaugh and the like late 80s, early 90s when he had like a show and he had his own sort of transgressive comedy. And that was a whole different time. And you can look up some archive stuff and videos of it. Like it's really good in the same way that I quite already enjoy um, Morton Downey Jr.'s sort of shock jock 80s style of hosting a television talk show. Like that's some really good stuff if you want some lore.
Yeah, I will say, and this is going back to kind of the era I grew up, but I there's despite him being by all accounts kind of a terrible person, I do kind of have a weird nostalgia for Rush Limbaugh, because it is very much the like driving around and your grandpa's pickup truck on listening to Rush Limbaugh and like the Dixie Chicks.
Oh man, I remember when they got canceled. What a good what a time
Yeah,
to be
I do
alive.
too.
Somewhat early, 2003, 2002, and just like the country music world just like totally turned their back on them. Now they're just the chicks, by the way. They're just the
They
chicks.
are. I didn't realize. I probably haven't thought about them since I was in practically in diapers. Honestly.
Well, I saw this like news article about them, like, and I just saw it where it was like, oh, the Dixie Chicks, but they've rebranded as the Chicks in the same way that Lady Antebellum had to rebrand as just Lady A, because any sort of association with the traditional cultural South, they were that's the issue nowadays is the culture war. But like the Dixie Chicks were canceled, for being anti-war about the invasion of Iraq. But I mean, almost everyone and their mother was at that time, and to speak out against it definitely puts you in the face of consternation. Although 2003 did have some of the largest anti-war protests in London and New York and DC.
Yeah, it's odd to me because to me, I feel like defining, definition between the millennials and Gen Z, at least to me, I think it is 9/11. Because I'm among the older Zoomers and I don't remember it. And I know that there's maybe someone who's technically Gen Z or technically a millennial who does or doesn't. But to me, that does kind of seem like can you remember that? Yes or no? That kind of tells you if you're in or out to a certain degree.
Oh, that's been my way of determining Gen Z versus millennials is do you have a strong living memory and recollection of that day? And if you don't, then I just lot you in with Gen Z.
Yeah, honestly, I think that one of my first memories is watching, like watching tanks burn on the news. Like watching and basically my grandma being like, "Yeah, that's what war is." It's like, and obviously that's a little bit later, but that is a defining memory for me. It's probably my first directly political memory if I think about it. And even then, it wasn't like so much so.
I mean, for me, it's definitely as a kid, it was like 2004's election, and just listening to the debates, and me as a kid, going on Yahoo News and things like that to check on the aspects of where the campaign trail was going. What did Bush and Kerry say? And of course, at that time, right, we have the issue of well, I remember a big talking point is that like John Kerry is going to make the war worse somehow, and there was a lot of concern at the time of where it was going to go because this was 2004, and the big issue in question was about what to do about Iraq. It's just it's a strange time to try and remember and recollect and realize that you grew up in that. And as I've said before, I did this with Geo talking about 21 years after 9/11. This is just that a big part of my political development, that those red pills is that entire sort of neoconservative rah American mindset that I grew up with has been forced to be fundamentally reevaluated, deconstructed, and re-examined because a lot of the lies that you were told onto and a lot of the things that you were bought onto as a kid are just fundamentally false. And now there's your political socialization that you grew up with totally just flipped on its head. And well, what good is this worth to me now? And you have to figure everything out.
Yeah, I mean, this is the age gap between you and I. I remember the McCain Obama election extremely well because I just remember obviously there was all of the baggage of the Bush years, but I remember very distinctly, being in the Bible Belt, the people were absolutely convinced John McCain had it. And it was so odd to me because to see adults, as a child, to be just so sure that they were right, and then so completely distraught when it didn't turn out, that it was like, it was like America fell, to a certain segment of the population. And it was just incredibly not disturbing in the sense that I had bad dreams about it. But I remember being to a certain extent feeling like, wait a minute, the adults don't know what's going on. And that was an odd moment for me.
Yeah, I mean, I was overseas when Obama was elected, and just to see my German neighbors get super excited over the fact that someone that wasn't like George W. Bush getting elected. And I mean, remember, Obama had a big rally campaign bit in Berlin, Germany, and it really did illustrate just how different things were. And of course, my more I don't want to say milk toast conservative, but I mean they're far less down the rabbit hole than I am, and probably for the best. God bless them. But I remember them sort of criticizing Obama on these policy bits, well, he's really inexperienced. He hasn't been in government long. He doesn't know anything about foreign policy, and that was a real wake up call for myself. Witnessing at 13 and such, rational arguments do not work in the face of raw emotional ethno-narcissism. And it's well, better keep that in mind in the back pocket to know how I'm going to engage with the rest of the world from here on out.
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I think that I think that I, to a certain degree, am almost reactionary by constitution. Just kind of baked into my personality. Even if I never found a term for that, I was kind of that by default. And I remember having a very similar, kind of reaction, during the kind of Obama years, where there were lots of it was a lot surrounding the debt, and it was graphs and math about the debt and how bad it was. And just kind of the realization that's it doesn't matter how many graphs you show, you don't win. There's no direct relationship between, essentially my facts, my reason, and essentially winning the day. And that to me was very and obviously I wasn't as clued into like the ethno-narcissist stuff at the time, right? I was in middle school, but I remember realizing that and being like, wait a minute, like this is not the game we've been told we're playing to a certain degree.
Oh yeah, and I mean, now it's just the mask off is some of the appreciation I kind of have for today's day and age. Is that um, there was this the myth of a civil society, and I mean at one point in time we did have that. Let's not kid ourselves, but I didn't the last vestiges of it I think really did die off in the Bush Obama years, and 2016 really was the ripping off the band-aid moment to know that like no, there are certain people that probably and work with that somewhere down the line ideologically, or the way that they raise their children or the way that you raise yours is fundamentally antithetical to their point of existence, right? And this is where you get that sort of like friend enemy distinction, because like your way of life is anathema to theirs, and yet you have to share this territory and space with them.
That's well said, and I think that I'm at least kind of coming to the end of time. I'm getting a little bit tired, but do you have anything you want to say before we wrap things up?
Well, I feel like a lot of what I've said has been sort of the greatest hits of some of my social commentary for the last little bit, but the only thing I really would add is that it does behoove all of us, as much as that we may enjoy our time online, is to also engage in healthy lifestyles off the internet as well. Don't get me wrong, I love, sometimes just going through Twitter and scrolling and doom scrolling and things like that, or watching a series of YouTube videos. I'm very bad with this. I like going through the Distributist's old vids because they're just very good and I like his voice. But I know that there are things I can also be more productive with my time with. So in an age and culture, especially for anyone under 30, I think that we really do face this really big burgeoning responsibility of making sure we are in a very good position to take care of ourselves mentally, physically, and spiritually. And it sounds so strange that this like weird Petersonian talking point gets rehashed and reiterated, but as more and more people come to this sort of side, and the more and more that everyone, lives on the internet, we really do have to come up with a positive vision that doesn't totally sell our souls out to the like online zeitgeist, but also allows us to be functioning human beings in the real world. That's, I think, is the big challenge for us lying ahead, for especially anyone Gen Z and after.
That's well said, and I think that it's important to remember that the purpose of the internet is not to win on the internet, right? Like the purpose of the internet is essentially to prepare you to do things in meat space. And I think all of us, myself included, are very, very capable of getting, kind of tunnel vision of like owning the libs, like chud posting or, base Taliban, and all those things are fun. But if that's the end of it, the end of it is just, post got likes, reactions on Telegram, it's kind of useless, and it can be fun, but it's not necessarily, effective. So as we wrap things up, Prude, do you want to get your plugs out of the way?
Oh, sure. I like that we're saying plugs or promotions rather than shilling. I've always found that shilling yourself shamelessly is always just never in good taste. So plugs and promotion, those are good words to use instead.
Well, look, see, as an American, I have an innate ability for for shameless self-promotion. So we've got to just present it well, of course.
Oh, of course. We just can't make it sound like we're like shady guys at like a swap meet or something.
Yeah,
but
used car salesman.
Yeah, exactly. No one needs to be Danny DeVito's character from Matilda, putting sawdust in the engine or whatever. But for everyone who's been listening, again, Jay, thank you so much for having me on. Greatly appreciated as always. You can find all of my links at findmyfriends.net, or frens.net/Prudentialist. I'm on YouTube, Rumble, Odyssey, Substack, Telegram, Twitter. Just find the wonderful Kermit the Frog PFP, like you have here from Clemens von Metternich, and you know that you found the right place. And for those who came here from my channel and my plugs and things like that, go subscribe to Mr. J. Burden. This is what is the more important part to do: friends, promoting, and helping friends. So I'm already glad that Mr. Burden is over 1,000 subs. He can apply for monetization. But most importantly, he's a very good interviewer. And by all means, keep him growing. He's a good guy.
Well, thank you very much. You've essentially done my shilling for me, which I appreciate. Anyway, guys, I will have some more streams coming up as I kind of get that through the pipe. I'll set up announcements and everything for that. Obviously, this show is available on YouTube. You can also find it on anywhere podcasts are found. We may have a new system for that, but as of now, my entire back catalog is available on Apple, on Spotify. Really appreciate if you give it a listen there. Obviously, I have a Twitter. I don't do much with it, but I do have a Telegram, and I'd really appreciate to talk to you guys there. And remember, guys, keep your head up. The light can't last forever. Good night.